be joined by the environment editor at the Daily Sceptic, Chris Morrison, to talk about an article that he's just written about a paper that was produced by a government-funded organisation about what our buildings might be constructed of in 20 or 30 years' time in order to meet the net zero requirements in 2050. Chris, a very good afternoon. Great to have you with me on the show. So what's going on here? There's some government-funded entity called UK Fires, F-I-R-E-S, that's produced a big paper to minimise new construction and that we need denser living and reduced transport needs. What's going on here? You've analysed it. You've read this report.
Hi, Richard, and hi to the viewers, of course. Mud is the answer to your first question.
Mud?
Yes. According to this report, we'll be using rammed earth, which I think is a technology that probably, when our distant ancestors came down off the trees, they probably started using mud. So it's back to nature. To be serious, this is a report from a company, an operation, as you say, funded by the taxpayer, 5 million quid. And they produce these wonderful reports which assume absolute net zero. And I like the work of UK Fires because it's, without wishing to disturb the learned friends, it's probably the only report that I see that isn't full of dishonesty and deceit on the true cost of net zero. And what they do is they assume that all of these so-called inventions and all of these ideas of carbon capture probably won't happen. They won't happen at scale. They're uneconomic. There isn't obviously enough batteries in the world to support wind farms. There aren't enough children in the Congo to mine the cobalt that you would need for a winter without power for a month with high pressure, for instance, this sort of thing. So they assume that they take a realistic view of what net zero really means. And they actually sort of, in one report, they assume about a third of the power that for instance, the government does in its plans for net zero. So what they've done with their latest report is they've looked at the construction business. And of course, they worked out that you need a vast amount of power in order to make the basic building blocks of life, of construction. So the report says no bricks.
No bricks, because obviously bricks require a huge amount of energy to make some 2 billion bricks a year?
Something like that, yeah. And it's a £1 billion or £2 billion business. No cement. Cement uses a lot of energy. That's a £9 billion business. And no glass, because glass also requires a lot of energy, 1,700 degrees centigrade. So the only glass they really look for is recycled from skips. So they see a dystopian world where, and of course they also talk a certain amount of social thing, 15-minute cities, denser living, all this sort of thing. But as I say, they're taking a realistic view of net zero. And a previous report, you might have seen, it certainly went viral on social media, a previous report talked about there's no flying, there's no shipping by 2050. They talked about no cement, 60% of heat only to heat homes and cook food, no beef, no lamb. This is what... Yeah.
So let's just be clear. They've received 5 million quid of our cash to produce a report which essentially says that we need to stop using bricks and glass and cement, and I think it also goes on to say basically you can only recycle steel in our buildings, but we could be lucky enough to use a bit of stone, earth and timber. So we're not going to have any really tall buildings. And we're not going to be able to look out of... we have sort of open windows, but basically no glass. So it's going to be pretty chilly.
Yes, and no plastic either. And of course, the idea that we insulate our homes. I live in an older house. It has wood windows and doors, and it's well ventilated. It's very nice at times, very healthy. But if I wanted to completely cut off all those drafts, I would have to go the plastic route because plastic doesn't move. But of course, no plastic.
Absolute madness. If anybody wants to discuss this with us, give us a call 0344 499 1000. And if Chris can hear your question, ask Chris a question about this, because Chris studies it as much as anybody. Chris, is it possible that actually this group is doing us a favour and playing devil's advocate, that actually it's a good use of taxpayers' money? Because if they're telling us the truth then if sufficient number of people, and indeed possibly maybe some bright people in government, maybe some bright people in civil service say, actually, this is probably not a very good way to go, and therefore we need to change course on this. Maybe that might be a sensible outcome.
Yes, as I said at the beginning, I'm loving the UK fires reports. I think they're brilliant because they're the only honest thing I seem to read on net zero. If you want net zero, this is what's going to happen. It's as simple as that. Now, I think that politically, and you see it as well, I'm sure, certainly those on the right are starting to think, hello, this net zero thing doesn't look like a very good idea. But I would always caution, because you say I write for the Daily Sceptic, I also write on the science of climate change, and that's another interest of mine, that if you do genuinely believe there's an existential threat, then we don't have to go within 30 years living in mud huts. We have to do it. So it's a case for not only re-examining the true cost of net zero, which I think fires gives us a valuable insight into doing, which you don't get elsewhere, but also looking at the science. Is CO2 as much of a problem as you might think? And I just, if anybody wants to talk about that, I would just always say to people who believe that humans cause all or most climate change, show me a single science paper that proves conclusively that proposition is proven beyond adequate, beyond reasonable doubt. There isn't one. There is not a single paper. It's an unproven hypothesis, and there are other hypotheses which have been suppressed, such as the saturation of CO2. It's sort of after a certain point that the heat gets trapped and there's no more heat to trap. All of these other propositions have been suppressed. So we need not only an honest appraisal, which UK fires gives us into the cost of net zero, I think we also need an honest appraisal into the science.
Absolutely right, because there's this suggestion that from those on the other side of the debate who seem to think that it's only human-produced CO2 that creates global warming, but that natural CO2 doesn't. They don't ascribe any input or any sort of value or data to that. But actually we know that the majority of CO2 is produced naturally. So how does that work?
Well, this is it. I mean, you're absolutely right in pointing out what can be a flaw in the argument, that 96% of CO2 is produced naturally. So let's hope that when we get rid of our measly 4%, the other 96% behaves properly. Some I suspect that it won't. One very good way to go to net zero is to die.
We don't. Yeah, that's not very attractive.
But we take in, I forget exactly the figure, but I think we take in something like 0.4 carbon dioxide, and we produce 4%. So not only are animals producing all this greenhouse gas, we, by us having a chat here, are contributing to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So if say we could arrange for humans to 9 billion humans to disappear, we'd be great. The problem solved.
Well, Muckley,
I'm being silly because the whole thing strikes me sometimes as extraordinarily silly.
Well, you'll enjoy this, Chris. Muckley from Yorkshire. I suspect that's not his real name. He messages in, blimey, Richard, sounds like from what Chris is saying, we'll be living in the planet with no cars, only horses and mud huts. Maybe that will deter the boats. I mean, I think he's being ironic and facetious. But the point is well made. This isn't what we want, folks. It's utter madness. But we have actually got, also, just to finish, Chris, we have now got the Business Select Committee in the House of Commons recognising that with net zero we'll be unable to keep the lights on because we're not producing enough electricity, and we won't be able to produce enough electricity.
Renewable energy is about the worst way, if you like, almost to produce energy, it seems to be. The medievalists gave it up 400 years ago. Windmills, there's not enough power in it. It's environmentally destructive. You're looking at decimating bat raptor populations, the offshore wind farms. We've seen evidence in the United States. You look at all the permits that they get to harm the whales that pass through. They actually get permission to disturb them. The more we learn about this crazy, I have to say it's crazy, rush to net zero without any real debate or consideration.
Well, just hang on there. We've got a caller here from Nottingham who I think may have a question for you, Chris. Steve, good afternoon. Thanks for calling in. Have you got a question for Chris or an observation?
I have, Chris. Richard, sorry. Yes, Chris. If you've got a log burner at home, they're moaning about small particles, but yet Drax Power Station, it's burning millions and millions of tons of wood pellets from America and Canada, and it's also being subsidised by the taxpayer, yet they're making huge profits, and they're paying shareholders millions and millions of pounds, and surely that's not right, is it? Chris,
I hope you heard that. What do you think?
It's another one, another ludicrous example that they count. You're talking about Drax, in fact, and I assume, and they contribute 6% of all so-called green energy. And I forget the exact subsidy figure, but I think it's somewhere around 80 million they've had so far. And that counts to, when they say, 50% of energy is renewables. It's ridiculous because obviously a carbon footprint, if that's what you're particularly worried about, is enormous by transporting this stuff from North America. And there have been suggestions that what they're chopping down is not necessarily renewable timber. They're actually chopping down quite old trees.
I think that's right. And actually, Chris, I've heard that they don't count, and to Steve's point, they don't count the emissions from the biomass pellets that they burn here in the UK in their calculations when they think it's renewable, because they know the answer. Steve, great call, great question. You are bang on the money. Let's quickly go to Basingstoke, where Simon may have a question for Chris.
Well, my question for Chris is about the geopolitical impact of the Western pursuit of net zero. We've already seen this in the changing relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and the United States, where they're actually willing to trade in currencies other than dollars because they want to have a market made for them. And my question for Chris is, why are we taking such a hair-shirt approach to this whilst the rest of the world is actively pursuing growth policies based on the expansion of energy production? Last year, more coal was burnt at any other time in history. This seems to me like it's literally a very cunning plot to make sure that the West uses an awful lot less energy, has no industry, has less power, and the developed world, particularly like the BRIC nations, have all the power and all the manufacturing and all the wealth.
Well, I mean, where to start? I could write a book. I might one day, or two books.
We've got a minute, Chris.
We've got a minute. So very briefly, I would say that it's a massive punch down you're seeing with net zero. It's a punch down from rich, virtue signaling elites who are transferring huge amounts of money through these green subsidies. They think they'll be okay. They think they'll still be living in nice houses, meat diets, transport. But I'm afraid that the people who are going to be really affected are the poor. If you don't have assets, if you live in the developed world, you are going to really suffer because you're going to remove energy from the mix. And within 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuel. If you remove that within 30 years, it will be catastrophic. And as you say, the people that will also benefit are people who are perhaps not quite as friendly to us.
Fantastic. Great point. Simon, thank you very much for that point. Chris, really appreciate that. This will make you laugh. Pete from Herefordshire says, Richard, can we build some of these future houses now and make the Just Stop Oil and Co. live in them and see what they think of them? That's a fantastic way to conclude this discussion. Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Morrison, environment editor at the Daily Sceptic. He's read this report from this organisation that's had 5 million quid of our cash called UK Fires. And the truth is, they didn't want us to have bricks or glass or cement or steel. No, they just want us to have a bit of stone and open windows and a bit of earth. Great. That doesn't sound like progress to me. What about you? Stay with us.